Whack! That's where we're going to start this next episode of Bow Hunt or Die. It is the shoulder shot deer.
It sounded like I hit him with a 2x4.
Guys, you've all heard that noise before. It's not good. And it is the next conversation we're going to be having with Tracker John, and the professional dog tracker that we all love. I love him the most because when I need him, he delivers and finds all my deer. So we're going to start with that ugly sound. I've heard it before. I've did it. I'm an honest guy. I'm going to tell the truth. The shoulder shot deer. John, I got to imagine you get that phone call.
I do, and I don't like it. My least favorite hit of all. Shoulder, high hits, bad news. If I never went on any more of those tracks, I'd be good with that. It's very low odds. Not to say it can't happen, but low odds. Justin,
I know you have all kinds of feelings about the shoulder shot deer, arrows, broadheads, heavy arrows, but let's stay focused on, before we get into that, as a bow hunter, what should you do first when that shot arises?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking both of you guys.
You're the one with the
Don't
most
shoot him.
experience?
Don't shoot him in the shoulder to start with, I think.
We're asking the professional tracker.
So let me start by this, because I think when it comes to shoulder hits, one of the most commonly debated or hotly discussed topics online, right, is going to be broadhead choice.
Oh boy.
So when somebody calls you with a shoulder hit, do you have a preference? And if they were shooting a mechanical over a fixed blade, like, have you noticed any difference in your ability to recover an animal or your recovery rate based on what type of broadhead they shot?
And stay focused on the shoulder now.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's all bad. You just don't want to be hitting the shoulder, no matter what arrow you're shooting or what broadhead. Now, having said that, if you are going to hit the shoulder or some heavy bone, I do think there is something to, the weight forward heavy arrow, the long length broadhead to the narrow width. For that particular instance, a very narrow instance, I would give it the nod, but even with that stuff, I would not be wanting to hit the shoulder or bone, because now a lot of times you see these guys doing these demonstrations. They'll take a shoulder blade or leg bone, prop it up against the bale, and they'll punch through it time after time after time. Well, that's a false read. That's not what's happening on a live animal. You're not getting a totally braced bone like that's perpendicular, that's not moving. With a live animal, there's all kinds of angles and motions that can change everything. So even with the same setup that was punching through it when it's propped against the bale, when it's in a live animal and that animal's twisting, you're hitting the bones at angles. Even with the great broadheads, I would not count on a good success. I mean, it could happen, but
Tracker John looked like it was in a dance studio there for a minute.
Yeah, well, I think he's absolutely right, because it's just something that people don't take into consideration when they're running through these scenarios in their heads of, like, what makes sense to us, like, again, in a repeatable kind of a lab type situation versus what's happening in the field when you have an animal that's in motion, because they almost always are, right? And usually, that animal is moving vertically as your arrow is coming towards it. So you have forces that are going not necessarily opposite, but shearing against each other, right? With that shoulder being driven down as that arrow's being driven forward, which is always going to impede penetration. As you said, with the shoulder too, I think there's a lot of folks that don't take into consideration the fact that it's not really attached to their body, right? It's only by bone anyways. It's attached by ligaments, right, and it's floating fluid in there. So it can move quite a bit when it's hit. So to your point, it's not braced. So You know,
And then the wild card is, and you have no control over this, is rotation of the blade, what angle it hits at. If it was like this or like
right.
this, angled. I mean,
Well, and then when
that
you
all
look at the
depends on the
anatomy
rotation.
of a shoulder bone, a shoulder blade itself, like it varies pretty dramatically in just a matter of a couple inches from the base
Right.
of that shoulder blade to the ridge to that big flat, portion of that we think of as the scapula. So again, I mean, not to get too much into deer anatomy and broadheads and everything, but there are no sure things in deer hunting. I think we've all seen a variety of different outcomes with variety of different arrow setups and broadhead setups and the size of the deer and all sorts of different stuff. So
But let's
when
stay
you get
focused on that
when you
shoulder
get
shot deer.
the shoulder shot and you do recover the animal, what do you most frequently see? Are we talking single lung hit? Are they getting through and getting more than one lung? Are they hitting arteries, veins? I mean, what is the best outcome on a shoulder hit that you get a call for?
All of the above. But okay, we were talking about broadheads. Once the guy shot at the deer and hit the deer, okay, the broadhead discussion's kind of out the window. Let's assume somebody's taking their shot. They're hitting the shoulder or the bone, regardless of what the broadhead is. What that guy wants to watch very carefully upon his shot is to try to determine what his penetration is. And that can be tricky. If the arrow's in line, it's hard to see what the depth of it is. If it's perpendicular, it's a lot easier to see what the penetration was. Very often people are wildly off with what the penetration was because of that. And with lighted knocks, a lot of the times they're looking at that knock and it's superimposed on the body, and it can throw off that estimate of the penetration. And that's very important because, well, if you've only gone in like this, we're not getting that deer. But if you've poked through, to your question, maybe it is single lung, and I'm not saying sometimes there's not instances where things were right and it goes all the way to the opposite shoulder and skewers everything. But you want to get, if you can, an idea of what your penetration is. To give a little better read on how to proceed and what the likelihood of success is.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, but it is kind of critical. So to your question, yeah, a lot of times all we're getting is muscle meat. Sometimes, again, back to that floating shoulder, sometimes with a whirling animal or whatever, and lots of times I've seen arrows pass between the rib cage and that floating shoulder, never entering the rib cage, but yet looking like it was awesome penetration. And oh, that's a killer shot. Well, it wasn't. But so there's lots of things that can go on and give you a fairly good blood trail initially, but it's not going to last long. Now, if you do punch into the rib cage, the question is, what depth did you get? Then do you get just one lung? Did you go far enough or get lucky enough? It's in a place where you did hit a good artery or something substantial. But if you're throwing out that one lung, that's trouble. That's
So
trouble.
with this particular case with the shoulder, right? Here you are, you're in your tree, that arrow is released, you hear that awful noise, you're doing everything in your power to keep an eye on that deer, you're seeing how far the arrow's out, etc. The goal of this is giving people the best advice on how to try to recover that shoulder shot deer. So at this point right now, what's your recommendations? Are they waiting longer? What are your recommendations for the shoulder shot situation?
Well, again, depending on what you think you've observed, it doesn't require the waiting time like the gut shot that we discussed. It is certainly weather dependent again. If you got some weather coming in, you better get on it, and I wouldn't worry about having to go too soon. Better to be able to trail than have it washed away.
Nothing.
But generally, I would give it a few hours and then see what you got. You can always back out if you see some kind of evidence that you think you need to back out, or you bump them, then you can back out.
So on a shoulder shot deer that you recover, I mean, do you have a guesstimate maybe on average length of a track job on a shoulder shot when you do end up finding them, if it's a single lung that they die from? Are we talking a couple 100 yards, a couple miles? I'm sure you've seen it all, but if you had to kind of go with an average.
Well, again, it's such a wildly disparate scenario that we're dealing with. Did you in fact punch in and get some lungs or artery, or I've even recovered those a few of those ones where it didn't enter the rib cage, but it sliced enough going between, so there was enough blood loss over time.
Sure.
And that's going to go a long ways. Generally, you're probably talking a mile or two with something like that.
See, I shot one last year that was similar to that, and it passed between his shoulder and his rib cage. It barely nicked into the bottom of the cage on its way down, big mechanical, and there was a slice in the bottom of the cage maybe this big. I think it barely nicked a lung. I mean, just barely nicked the bottom of a lung, but whatever it caught in between that shoulder and the rib cage, like, it just bled like crazy. I mean, I never had a blood trail so good. The deer still went a couple 100 yards. I found it the following morning because we had to contact the neighbor. Went onto the neighbor's property, so we had to leave him overnight. But I mean, I don't think that deer died from like a lung. I mean, that was whatever I hit in there was because the deer was walking pretty much the whole time, walking and just kind of pouring blood out. So clearly there's some arteries, veins and stuff that are running on the inside of that shoulder there.
Absolutely. As I say, I for sure have recovered numerous deer in that scenario where the arrow never entered the rib cage. But some of them had gashes, 10, 12 inches long, and just splayed open. And there will be, on those, at least initially, a horrific blood trail. I mean, it's cutting a lot, and it's all dropping on the ground. It's not internal. Sure. It's going to be on the ground. But I've seen trails like that were just horrific blood trails to begin with that then petered out almost to nothing to see, and we'd have to go a mile or even 2 miles or whatever before we end up getting the deer.
And usually on a shoulder shot, if you are punching through the shoulder, in most cases there is no exit. In most cases, the entry's usually high. A lot of times the arrow stays in the deer at least for a pretty considerable amount of time. They tend to carry it with them, so that can certainly inhibit blood exiting to be able to track.
Yeah, with the exception of muscle wounding in the shoulder shot, which can bleed quite prolifically. Barring that, what you have is probably going to be internal, and once again, that's why those shots are my least favorite. They're just nothing good about them.
Okay.
So don't shoot them in the shoulder is what you're saying.
Exactly. As in all cases, pick your shots. Don't take a shot that you know that you're not going to make. Be careful.
All right.
And even when you're careful, then still stuff can happen. But let's minimize.
He's looking at you.
All right. Well, there you go. Do not shoot him in the shoulders. Avoid
and
all
one
costs.
lung hits, even if it's not the shoulder, you're ending up with a one lung hit.
We'll get into that.
Oh, okay.
We'll get into that one next. All right, there you go, folks. Stay away from the shoulder. That is the recommendation of the professionals. Avoid the shoulder at all costs.
I think it's the recommendation of the non-professionals as well. That's just everybody's
all bow hunters
recommendation. Avoid the shoulder at all costs.
That's a wrap.